Good morning. Please raise your hands if you cannot hear me. Uh-oh, I'm afraid they can't hear. Oh, how many hours, what time do I have for the speech?
2 hours.
2 hours. Free software is a technical thing, but the issue of free software is not a technical issue. It's an ethical, political, and social issue. It's the issue of what the rules of society should be for using software. Most of the time, when people consider this question, they work for software companies, so they consider it from a self-serving direction. They ask themselves, what rules can we impose on everyone else to make them pay us a lot of money? I'm sure you've heard the answers that they get. I had the good fortune in the 70s to be part of a community of programmers who cooperated and shared software. And because of that, I was able to look at this basic question from a different direction, to ask, what rules make for a society that's good to live in? And I came up with completely different answers, which are the subject of this talk. But let me say a little about this community. It consisted of programmers at some of the best universities. Sometimes programmers at computer companies participated also. In this community, if you wrote a program, you would share it. It was normal, and other people could share it too. The lab where I worked, the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT, was in a way the deepest part of this community, because there, all the software we used was the community's software. It was all free software. So this was possible because the staff hackers at the lab had developed our own time-sharing system, the incompatible time-sharing system, or ITS for short, and my job was improving this system. Because we had our own time-sharing system, we didn't have to use any non-free software. We were able to live a life of freedom to cooperate. So in this community, if you walk past another hacker's screen, and because hacker is what we called each other, we the programmers in this community, if you came past another hacker's screen and saw something unusual, you'd say, hey, what is that? And he would say, that's the new foobar program that we just got from Stanford, and it's in the foobar directory. So you would look in that directory and see, of course, the executable that you could run, but also the source code that you could read and study to see how they solved those problems. In running the program, you'd probably come across bugs, and you might have ideas for new features. You could go to the source code and fix the bugs and add the new features. You could make all sorts of changes. You could even cut a piece of the source code out and put it into another program that you were writing, perhaps for a different overall job. So you could use the program not only by running it, but in all the various ways it could be useful. The software we developed was part of human knowledge. Our work was a project to contribute to human knowledge, and our work was available to everyone. And I felt very good about my work because of the fact that it was meant for everyone. It was not just to help one group of people defeat some other group of people, or beat them out for some prize, which I would not feel very proud of. But then we all got a taste of what life was like for the other computer users, the ones who were not part of a community like ours. This happened when Xerox gave MIT a laser printer. Now, you may have heard this story. This is actually one of the many things that called my attention to the ethical issues of free software. It's not as if this all by itself taught me right from wrong, but it did make me think. This laser printer was in some ways a very good printer. It printed a page per second. It had very high resolution, and straight lines were nice and straight, much better than our old printer. But in one way it was not better, because it got frequent paper jams. And this printer was in a place that not many people wouldn't see it very often. They would only go there when they were looking for output. So it would stay jammed for a long time. When we recognized this, we of course thought about trying to solve it the way we solved the problem for the old printer, which also got paper jams. And unlike the new printer, the old printer was very slow. So we were not printer engineers, we were programmers. We couldn't make the printer any better, but we were able to write features in the software to compensate for the problems of the printer. For instance, there was a feature that every time the old printer finished printing a file, the system displayed a message on the user's screen saying, "Your file foo has been printed." So you had to wait because the printer was slow, but you didn't have to wait extra just because of having to guess when it was time to go to the printer. You knew when it was time to go to the printer. And because of the paper jams, I added a feature that every time the printer got jammed, the system displayed a message on the screen for each user waiting for printing, saying, "The printer is in trouble, go fix it." If you got that message, you would not dare assume someone else would fix it, because you knew only a few people would get this message. So you would go to the printer immediately. So the printer still got jammed, but a minute later, 2 or 3 people would come and fix it. And as a result, we kept the old printer running. The jams happened, but they didn't keep it down for very much time. That was good, so of course we thought about using the same solution for the new printer. But there we ran into a stone wall. We couldn't even try. You see, we were able to add this feature for the old printer because the old printer was controlled by a free program, part of the community's software. So we had the source code, and we were therefore able to make changes limited only by our own skill. But the new printer was controlled by a proprietary Xerox program, and we didn't even have the source code. So we were unable to make any changes at all. We were prisoners of our software. The result was constant frustration. You'd type the command to print a file and go back to work, and you wouldn't think of going to the printer soon because you know it's not worth it. So after a while you notice, oh, it's been half an hour. It's not worth going to the printer yet. I'll keep working. So you go back to work, and a while later you notice it's been a whole hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it's been jammed the whole time. So you fix the jam and go back to work, and a while later you notice a time. Oh, it's been half an hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it had printed 200 pages of other people's stuff, which was 3.5 minutes of printing for this fast printer, and then jammed again. And at that point you'd say, I'm going to stand here and fix this damn thing every time it jams until my output comes out. And you'd actually wait at the printer, which is, of course, what you were hoping to avoid doing by not going up sooner. Constant frustration, and what made it even worse was to realize that we could have solved the problem, but Xerox was deliberately standing in our way, deliberately keeping us helpless. Then I heard that somebody at Carnegie Mellon University had a copy of that source code. Eventually I was visiting there, so I went to his office and said, "Hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code?" And he said, "No, I promised not to give you a copy." I was not only angry, I was shocked. I couldn't think of a way to express my anger that would do justice to it, not all of a sudden. All I could think of was to walk out of his office without saying even one more word to him. But I kept thinking about it afterward. You see, his refusal to cooperate with his colleagues at MIT, his shocking refusal, was bad for us because we never got that source code and we were never able to fix the problem, and that printer was frustrating to use for all the years we kept using it. But indirectly, it was very good for me because it taught me an important lesson, which is especially important because most computer users don't learn it. You see, he had promised to refuse to help his colleagues at MIT, but he didn't just do that to us. Chances are he did it to you as well. And I'd say he probably did it to you too. He might have done it to some of the rest of you, except I think most of you escaped because you weren't born yet. That was around 1980. But if you were already in existence, you were among the victims of his promise to refuse to cooperate with other people, because he did this to just about the entire population of planet Earth. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement. This was my first encounter with a non-disclosure agreement. I was the victim. I and my whole lab were the victims. And the lesson this taught me was that non-disclosure agreements have victims. They are not harmless, they are not innocent, they are doing wrong to other people. Most computer users first encounter a non-disclosure agreement when they're invited to sign one. You've probably been invited to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the time, there's some kind of temptation or goodie that they're going to get if they sign. So they make up excuses to ignore the ethical issue of what they are doing. They say, they'll never get copies anyway, so why shouldn't I join the conspiracy to deprive them? They say, this is the way it's always done. Who am I to go against it? Or they say, if I don't sign this, somebody else will. Various excuses to gag their consciences. But when someone invited me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, my conscience was already sensitized. I was already aware of what it felt like to be the victim. And I could not, my conscience would not let me turn around and do the same wrong to you. That was a few years later, so probably most of you were born. I said, thank you for offering me this nice software package, but I cannot accept it on the conditions you have set, so I'll do without it, no thanks. And thus I have never knowingly signed a non-disclosure agreement for generally useful technical information such as software. There are other kinds of information that raise different ethical issues. For instance, there is personal information. I think it's legitimate to keep people's personal information private for them, and I can make a promise to do that. But when it comes to generally useful technical information, the stuff of science and technology, the mission of these fields is to develop knowledge for people to use. If we withhold this knowledge instead, we are betraying the mission of our field. After some years of thought, I reached the conclusion that this was wrong, that nobody should do this, and in particular, I should not do this. But during the same period of time, a series of blows fell on my community and destroyed it. I think the final blow was when digital discontinued making the PDP-10 computer. You see, the incompatible time-sharing system was written in assembler language for the PDP-10. So when the PDP-10 became obsolete and was discontinued, 15 years of our work turned into dust and blew away. Now you can imagine that's a hard blow in itself, but its consequences were much worse. You see, at that time, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary, and you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement just to get the binaries that you could run, which didn't mean you would get the source code. So this meant I faced a moral dilemma. I could no longer keep on doing my work of operating system development in the same way that I had been doing it, because that depended on having a community of people to cooperate with and a body of free software to use and improve in cooperation with those people. Both of them were gone. The community had blown away and had disintegrated, and the software was obsolete. So what was I going to do? The most obvious option was to accept that the world had changed and adapt myself to it. In other words, to be Shaw's reasonable man, which would have meant using non-free software and signing non-disclosure agreements. And I'm sure MIT would have had me developing non-free software too. I realized that this way I could have fun, and I could have fun programming, and I could make money. But at the end, I would look back at my career and say, I have spent my life building walls to divide and imprison people, and I would be ashamed of everything I had done. So I looked for some other option, and it was easy to think of one. I could leave the computer field and do something else. Programmers often find this peculiarly unthinkable. They can't imagine that they might leave the software field. Well, in the US today, a lot of them don't have any choice. But they used to think that they did have a choice. And they would say, if I don't do this, this, and this to get a programming job, I'll starve. That's literally what they said. Well, even in the US, and I think also in Turkey, there are millions of people who don't work with computers, and they're not all starving. A few of them are in the US, but that's a different problem. I had no other special noteworthy skills, but I could have become a waiter. Perhaps not at a fine restaurant, but I could have been a waiter somewhere. Now, there are two things to note about being a waiter. One is, as a waiter, you're not doing anything unethical, except perhaps if you work at McDonald's. And second, as a waiter, you're not going to starve. except perhaps if you work at McDonald's. People don't know this, but the popularity of McDonald's is due to an error, a confusion made by poorly educated Americans. They heard the term fast food and they thought it meant rapid food. They didn't realize it meant food for not eating. The purpose of fast food is to help you fast. So if you are fasting, but you're feeling hungry and you're feeling tempted to eat, you can think of that McDonald's product and lose your appetite. And that way you can complete your fast. I suppose that must be more useful advice here than in Cambridge. So maybe they need to have more McDonald's here. Anyway, now if somebody ever suggests to you that you should actually eat at McDonald's, you now understand how to explain why that's a mistake. But anyway, I had found a way I could ethically survive in my situation. And that's an important thing, because sometimes you can justify doing something unethical if the only alternative is that something even worse happens to you. You know, if you were literally going to die otherwise, you could justify developing a non-free program. But I've never heard of anyone who was really in that situation. So I had found an ethical way to survive, but I didn't like it very much. Being a waiter for me would be no fun at all, and it would be a waste of my skills as an operating system developer. Now, it's better to waste your skill than to misuse it. Developing non-free software would be misuse of my skills, making the world a worse place. It's much better to do nothing. Better, but not good. So for those two reasons, I decided to look for some better option. I asked myself, what could an operating system developer do that would be positive, that would make the world a better place? And I realized that operating system development is exactly the job that was needed. The moral dilemma existed for me and for any computer user because all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. So if someone were to develop another operating system and say, you can use this in freedom, this is free software, that would give everybody a way out of the moral dilemma, a way to escape from the bad choices that they faced. And I realized that this was probably the most important thing I'd ever have a chance to try to do in my whole life. And I concluded I had been elected by circumstances to do this job. It's as if you saw someone drowning and you knew how to swim and it were not Bush, then you would have a moral duty to save that person. Well, I don't know how to swim, but I do know how to write software. And in this case, the work that had to be done was writing software. I was concerned about this problem, and I could see that hardly anyone else was paying any attention to it at all. I had the skills necessary to try to solve it, and I could see that probably no one would do it if I did not. So I decided I would develop a free software operating system or die trying, presumably of old age, because at the time the free software movement had no enemies. We just had a large collection of software that we would have to write to carry out this plan. This decision led to technical design decisions. What kind of system should it be? I had just seen one free operating system turn into dust and blow away because it was written in assembler language for a machine that became obsolete. I didn't want to write another system and have the same thing happen. So clearly I wanted to make the new system portable. But I just knew of one successful portable system, and that was Unix. So I decided to follow the design of Unix, figuring that way there'd be a good chance I would succeed in making a system that would run and be portable. Further, I realized that users do not like incompatible changes. Just a second. Wearing this is supposed to help with the swelling in my wrist, which is caused by my elbow problem. Anyway, and the reason I was checking the bottle of water is I wanted to see if it was made by Coca-Cola Company. Because there's a worldwide boycott of Coca-Cola Company. They were having thugs kill union organizers in Colombia. And they've been doing some nasty things in other countries as well. So I'm participating in the boycott. So I was talking about how users don't like incompatible changes. If I had put together all the best ideas I had seen in various systems with my own pet ideas, I could have made my dream operating system. But when I showed it to users, they would have said, this is incompatible. We've already trained our users to use Unix, and we've written our software to run on Unix, and it would be too much work to switch to your system, so no thanks. At that point, I would have had a ready-made excuse. I could have told myself, I offered them freedom and they didn't take it, so it's their fault. But I wanted to make more than just an excuse for failure. I wanted to build a community that would have people living in it, living in freedom. So I had to develop a system that people would use. Being compatible with an existing system was a good way to help people switch. So I decided to make this system upward compatible with Unix. Upward compatible meaning we could add more features, but the features of Unix should continue to work in our system. This decision had an interesting consequence. Unix consists of many components that work together using interfaces that were more or less documented. So deciding to be compatible with Unix means deciding to use the same interfaces, which means that all the initial design decisions were made. The remaining design decisions were internal to one component, and they could wait until somebody wanted to write that component. So the only other thing I needed was a name. We hackers enjoy the spirit of playful cleverness. So whatever we're doing, whether it's programming or something else, we enjoy finding ways to be playfully clever. And that includes giving names to programs. We like to pick clever or even mischievous names. And there was a hacker tradition that when you were writing a program that's similar to an existing program, and this was something that often had to be done back in the days before programming languages were portable. You'd see some nice program on some other computer system. The only way you could have it, such a thing, was to write another one. We had a tradition that in a case like that, you could give your program a name that is a recursive acronym, which says that your program is not the other one. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, there were many similar text editors called Tico, something or other Tico. But one clever hacker called his program Tint, for Tint is not Tico. The first recursive acronym. We thought this was so much fun that we quickly looked for other opportunities. In 1975, I developed the first Emacs extensible text editor, the editor that you could reprogram while you were using it. And there were many imitations of Emacs. Some of them were called this or that Emacs, but one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs, and there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs, and Ina for Ina is not Emacs, and Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. Ina was mostly rewritten, and version 2 was called Zwei, for Zwei was Ina initially. So you could have lots of fun with recursive acronyms. And I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix. But I quickly discovered that none of those combinations was a word, at least not in English. And if it doesn't have a second meaning, it's not funny. So I had to do it another way. I thought, what if I make a contraction? Then I could get a 3-letter recursive acronym. So I started trying letters: Anu, Bnu, Knu, Dnu, Inu, Fnu, GNU. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language, so that had to be the name. The reason the word GNU is used for so much wordplay is that, according to the dictionary, it's pronounced new. However, when it's the name of this operating system, please ignore the dictionary and pronounce it GNU. If you talk about the new operating system, you will get people very confused. You see, we've been working on it for over 20 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is and always will be GNU, no matter how many people call it Linux by mistake. So, having chosen a name, I could start the project. In September 1983, I posted an announcement on the net asking for people to join in and help. And in January 1984, I quit my job at MIT to start writing pieces of the GNU system. I had to quit my job because if I had remained an MIT employee, MIT could have turned my work into proprietary software products. I didn't want to take the risk that that would happen, and I didn't want to have to get the MIT administration's approval for every detail of the license that I wanted to write, for every detail of how this would be distributed. So I quit my job, and that took them out of the equation. But the head of the lab was nice enough to let me keep using the facilities. So I started using a Unix machine at MIT to begin writing pieces of the GNU system. At the time, I thought that we would develop an entire system and then tell people, come and get it. But that's not what happened. For the first half of the year or so, I was writing programs that were not particularly of interest to users at the time, although they were necessary to have in a complete GNU system. But in September '84, I started writing GNU Emacs, which was my second implementation of the extensible text editor. And by early '85, it was working well enough I could use it for all my editing. And other people wanted to edit with it too, because this was not comparable to some component of Unix. This was something I thought that a good system had to have. It was something that these Unix users did not have, and that's why they wanted to use it right away on top of their Unix systems. There wasn't a GNU system yet. There were just a few pieces, but they could run these pieces on a Unix system if they wanted to. People began asking me for copies of GNU Emacs, and I had to decide what I would tell them, how I would respond. Of course, I put a copy in the FTP server directory, and that was good for people who were on the net. But most programmers in 1985 were not on the net. What was I going to say when they asked me to send them magnetic tapes? I could have said, I want to spend my time writing more pieces of the GNU system, not writing tapes. So please find a friend who can download it for you and put it on a tape. However, I had no job, and I was looking for some way to make money through my work on free software. So I announced, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape of GNU Emacs. And the orders began dribbling in. By the middle of the year, they were trickling in. I was getting 8 to 10 orders a month. And if necessary, I could have lived on that. Because I still live like a student. I've always thought of expensive habits as something, as traps to be avoided. They're dangerous because if you pick them up, then you develop a desperate need for money, and that starts to rule your life. Most Americans, if they start making this much money, they try to spend that much money. And they start buying houses and cars and boats and planes and rare stamps and artwork and adventure travel and children. All sorts of luxuries that place a tremendous burden on the world. And the result is they have to spend all of their time desperately trying to make money to pay for this, and they have no time left to enjoy any of it. What a shame. What a waste. But if you resist these expensive habits, if you live cheaply, then you too will be able to decide what to do with your life instead of letting the people with the money decide for you. Don't make the mistakes so many other people make. Don't tell yourself that if you buy all these expensive things, then you won't have to spend all your time desperately trying to get money. So many people don't look at what happens to other people, and they don't learn from what happens to other people, so they have to learn the hard way, and then it's too late. But people used to say to me, what do you mean it's free software if it costs $150? The problem is that the English word free is ambiguous. One meaning refers to price, and another meaning refers to freedom. When we speak of free software, we're referring to freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. It's clearer in Turkish. So please resist the temptation to use the English word when you're speaking Turkish. If you use the Turkish word özgür, you will have no trouble with this confusion. Unfortunately, in English, there is no such word. There is no everyday word that means özgür and does not mean gratis. So there's no way to avoid this confusion, really. Some of the users of GNU Emacs had got their copies from me through the net, and they did not pay me. Others got their copies from me on a tape, and they did pay me. Others got their copies from somebody else instead of from me. Maybe they paid that somebody else, but they did not pay me. it was entirely between those two people if one had to pay the other. So I wouldn't have known. So GNU Emacs was gratis for some users, and it was paid for other users. But it was free software for all of them, because all of them had the essential freedoms that make it possible to cooperate with other people as part of a community and to control your own computer. So let me now give the definition of free software. That is, make precise which freedoms I'm talking about. A program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have the following 4 freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you see fit. Freedom 1 is the freedom to help yourself by studying the source code to see what the program really does and then changing it to do what you want. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies to others. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help build your community, the freedom to publish a modified version so others can benefit from your contribution. If you have all of these freedoms, the program is free software for you. But why are these the freedoms to use in the definition of free software? Why are these the important freedoms? Freedom 0 is I should go in another order. Freedom 2 is necessary on ethical grounds. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor. And the spirit of goodwill, the spirit of helping your neighbor, is the most important resource of any society. It's not a physical resource, it's a psychosocial resource, but it's no less essential for all that. It's no coincidence that the world's major religions have been encouraging people to help their neighbors for thousands of years, because the level of this attitude in society can be influenced a certain amount, and even a little more makes society better to live in. So it's very important to encourage other people to pick up more of this attitude or spirit of helping their neighbor. However, if you are using a program that doesn't give you freedom 2, you have been prohibited from helping your neighbor. And you are facing a moral dilemma, a potential moral dilemma that becomes real anytime somebody comes over and says, "Could I have a copy of that?" Because what are you going to say? You have to choose between 2 evils. One evil is to make a copy for that person and violate the license. And the other evil is to comply with the license and refuse to help that person. So you're forced to do one evil or the other. I believe the lesser evil is to make a copy for that person and violate the license. The reason is that person presumably has not done anything to deserve your refusal to cooperate. Whereas whoever has tried to impose between you and other people a license that prohibits you from copying and sharing is doing something evil, is trying to break the bonds of society. And that person is the one, if some wrong must be done, it should be done to that person because he's done something to deserve it. However, once you realize that using this program, which doesn't give you freedom 2, which comes with a license saying you're not allowed to copy and redistribute it, once you realize that using this means you potentially face a moral dilemma, the right thing to do is don't use it at all. The right thing to do is avoid going down the path that leads to the moral dilemma by not accepting the program in the first place. So my ethical commitment is, If I can't share the program with you, I won't take it. I'll say no. I will refuse to sign that non-disclosure agreement. Nowadays, the developers of non-free software and other non-free information are very powerful, and they have been getting the government on their side, and that's a very dangerous thing. The spirit of helping your neighbor is the most important resource of any society. So what does it mean when powerful social institutions tell you that you're not supposed to copy? They are poisoning that essential resource. And what does it mean when they say that if you copy, you're a pirate? If you share with your neighbor, you're a pirate. They're saying that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. And that's completely backwards morality, because attacking a ship is very bad, and helping your neighbor is good. And what does it mean when they start imposing harsh punishments on people who share? How much fear is it going to take before people are too afraid to share with each other? Do you want such a terror campaign to be organized in your society? The word terror campaign is well deserved. In 2 countries already, the developers of non-free software have threatened the public with being raped in prison if they use unauthorized copies of software. And threatening people with rape can only be described as a terror campaign. I think we should put an end to this terrorism. So that's the explanation for why freedom, too, is an essential freedom. The freedom to help your neighbor, but that is the freedom to distribute copies to others. The other freedoms are necessary so that you can have control over your own computer. Freedom 0 is obviously necessary. If you are restricted even in how and when and for what purpose you can run the program, then you don't control what you do on your computer. But freedom 0 is not enough, because if you don't have the source code, then you don't control what the program does. The developer controls it instead. In order for you to have control over your computer, you've got to be able to make the software do what you want. In many cases, non-free software has malicious features that are designed to hurt you, restrict you, or gain power over you. For instance, many non-free programs spy on the user. One prominent example is Windows. If you use the feature in Windows to search your files for a string, this sends a report to Microsoft saying, we think it says what string you're searching for. And also, Windows XP, when it asks for an upgrade, reports to Microsoft the list of the software on your disk. Microsoft introduced a feature several years ago in a previous version of Windows to make it report what was on your disk. And there was outrage about this, so Microsoft took it out and put it back in secretly. It now sends this information encrypted, which made it hard for people to tell that this was happening. It required some clever investigation. But Windows is not the only system that spies on you. Windows Media Player is also